This afternoon, we're privileged to have three additional distinguished representatives of contemporary art scholarship helping us to enjoy the exhibition's contents. First, we will be inviting Zung, who is the founder and director of Hanart TZ Gallery in Hong Kong. In that role, and also as an active curator and critic of Chinese contemporary art, Mr. Chang has probably done as much as anybody to introduce the work of new artists to a broader audience, and his writings have been profoundly influential to me and to many of us, particularly his sensitive reading about the role of writing in Chinese culture. His exhibitions include China's New Art post-1989 in 1993, special exhibitions at the Sao Paulo International Biennial in 94 and 96. In Hong Kong, he participated in the Sao Paulo Biennale in 1996, the Venice Biennale in 2001, and did a series of exhibitions called The Power of the Word, Strange Heaven, Chinese Contemporary Photography, Open Asia International Sculpture Exhibition, and in Venice in 2005, he did something called Yellow Box, a series of research projects about contemporary art practice and Chinese space. He's also most recently been involved in the Guangzhou Triennial. Mr. Zhang's talk will be followed by that by Dr. Martina Köppel-Young. She is an independent scholar and curator with a PhD in East Asian art history and sinology from the University of Heidelberg. She has written extensively on the subject of contemporary Chinese art and curated and co-curated many exhibitions on the subject. She's a member of the editorial board of Yishu, the Journal for Contemporary Chinese Art. She's a member of the editorial board of Red Flag Collection and a member of the advisory board of Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art, as well as a board member of Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong. She's done many important exhibitions and has been a very articulate interpreter of how contemporary ink art also relates to the past. Finally, the third speaker this afternoon is Mr. Ho Hanru. Ho Hanru has recently been appointed the artistic director of Rome's Maxi National Museum of 21st Century Arts. This is a really ambitious new building designed by Zaha Hadid, and he is the challenge of filling it, both with programs and with collections. He's up to the task, I might say. He was born in Guangzhou and educated at the Chinese Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing. And Dr. Ho moved to Paris after that in 1990, and he lived in France for 16 years, after which he moved to America in 2006, where he worked as the director of exhibitions and public programs at the San Francisco Art Institute. In addition to his teaching, his lecturing, and publishing on contemporary Chinese art around the world, he has curated numerous exhibitions, including Cities on the Move, 1997 to 2000, the French Pavilion in the 1999 Venice Biennale, the 2000 Shanghai Biennale, and most recently, the 2013 Fifth Auckland Triennial in New Zealand. So after these three speakers, we will have a discussion and question and answer period. We'll invite all of today's speakers to come to the stage and be available to discuss their ideas further between themselves and from questions from the audience. So that should be an exciting way to interact with the speakers. May I also remind everybody that during the presentations, photography in the auditorium is prohibited. So please do not use your cameras during people's presentations. Thank you, and welcome to our afternoon speakers. Jonathan?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Mike, for your introduction. and thank you to the Metropolitan team for organizing this symposium. It's an honor to be here, and it is particularly a happy occasion to see the celebration of Chinese art in such a esteemed institution. It certainly to say that Chinese contemporary art has come of age if it ends up in the Metropolitan Museum. The power of the word to talk that I'm going to give is based on actually two questions that I asked. And the first one is, if one wants to find a visual marker of modernity in China that marked the change from a pre-modern society to the modern, what would that visual marker be? And the second question really has to do with bones have to pick with modern Chinese art. Modern definition of fine art takes traditional literati art especially in very many new directions. But a lot of these new directions, including the ones you see in exhibition here today, would seem very unfine art by old aesthetic standards. So if we discard the old aesthetic standards, the old aesthetics of literati art, and still want to make a link between classical China and today's practices, what parameter can be used? And to answer the first question of the visual marker of modernity, one needs to imaginatively transport ourselves back to the pre-modern days. And if you imagine the 19th century in China, if you are dropped into any town, city, or village, what would be the main difference between an experience like that and, say, at the same period, a village on a town in Europe? And one of the most important visual difference, apart from architecture, would be the lack of figurative sculptures in the public space. I mean, apart from, say, religious Buddhist images, you would actually not find public sculptures of human figures, of leaders, of great writers, of poets, whereas in Europe you will always see, in Germany, Goethe's mooting somewhere in the public square, or an emperor on a horse. So this very major difference is now slowly being pulled together. If you transport yourself back again to Mao Zedong's days, during the Cultural Revolution, you hardly see anything else apart from the image of the great man and copies of his handwriting and a lot of calligraphy surrounding your everyday world. But what would have been the same? What would have occupied the same spaces that occupied statues in Europe in the 19th century? In China, they would have been replaced by stela. They would have been replaced by a lot of calligraphy in comparable sites. For example, in the UK today, if you go to the post office, you'll still see a portrait of Queen Victoria. And, Queen Elizabeth. I'm thinking 19th century. You still see a photograph of the Queen. But in the old days, you would, in a Chinese official place, you would see a piece of calligraphy by an important figure, probably an official. And if it's a very esteemed institution like a great monastery, probably a plaque written by Emperor Kangxi or Emperor Qianlong. So the presence of power, which is the which is the parameter you're using here, the visual language of power in traditional China and in traditional Europe is different. One uses basically the figurative form, the other uses the written word. And the radical shift in visual culture, the gradual rise of the figure in the public space is a very convenient marker to gauge the way Chinese society in the public world transform on its way to modernity. And also, if one again goes back to Mao Zedong's era, when at a time when the calligraphy of the leader and the portrait of the leader are both the most prominent thing you see anywhere in the visual world, perhaps it's hints that that was really the watershed. That was the time when these two visual languages of power started to meet and take a turn. The interesting thing that's being brought up by this would also be issues for calligraphy. In Chinese definition of fine art, people like to use although it's not necessarily true, but then people still, everybody believe in it. When Tang Taizhong said Zheng Qian's art, Zheng Qian himself embodied three excellences: poetry, calligraphy, and painting. It was the three excellences has since become the defining fine art of China, and of course, leading the way is poetry. Then comes the calligraphy. The last is painting. So calligraphy as visual art precedes painting. So it is considered the queen of fine art. And the queen of fine art of calligraphy and its relation to the world of cultural power, and also in its role in shaping the paradigm of cultural change in Chinese history is something that has always been looked at from the angle of aesthetics. But here, one can today, when now not everybody writes with a brush, and when today calligraphy has been finally museumized into a fine art, one can start to look at this with a more sober eye. The language, the use of these two different visual language of power also indicates a difference in the nature of power. When the presence of power is presented in the carnal physical presence of the figure versus the presence of power being presented in something that at least is cloaked in the physical form of culture. And the presence of the writing form as the presence of the person is not necessarily just restricted to political and cultural powerful figures. It became, over the centuries, one of the primary forms of self-cultivation for every Chinese person who's actually come to any form of learning. But coming back again to this comparative culture, simple comparative culture imagination, in Europe, the tradition of using writing in public has a long tradition. The Greeks and Romans did it. Here, I think is an interesting comparison. The use of script in public culture in the European tradition has always been an impersonal script. It is really about the content always, rather than the particular physical presence of the person. But in China, because it is made by a writing hand, the presence of power and the presence of the idea is incarnate in this writing hand. And the change of this language of power in the 20th century is phenomenal. And today, you see that the figure has taken over. But the memory of the importance of calligraphic writing is still practiced in China. Mao Zedong certainly understood it. He used both languages of power to mark this dynastic change, or civilizational change from Chinese to a westernized modern culture. Before I go further, perhaps we can look at some images. This is a famous garden in Hangzhou, and even in public spaces like this, you basically have calligraphy. And the statue of Wu Changshuo in the grotto was made, in fact, by a Japanese sculptor, a friend of his, and it was made in the teens, or in the 19-teens, and installed in the 20s. Again, in the same place. This is a temple with calligraphic decoration, another architectural adornment using the written word. And here's remnants of the Cultural Revolution. Mao posing, showing that he's doing homework. This is actually a cover of a magazine. It says Chinese women. Mao's calligraphy. Mao Zedong on a cigarette brand. The red flag sedan car. Now, the Cultural Revolution is a very interesting era. At that time, it must be one of the very few times when spontaneous mass practice of calligraphy and a practice of calligraphy in a public space was at a high point. And all types of expressions were all made on this democracy wall and other public spaces. But there's one thing to take note in here. You notice some of these big words. During the Cultural Revolution, or in fact during Mao's reign, there is a new type of script that was introduced. And the script was called the New Way style. The New Way style is a type of script which has a very clear, forceful presence, but it is halfway between a handwritten script and a print script. So the personality of the writer is vastly diminished, diminished perhaps in favor of the message that comes across. So in a way, this also highlights the era of Mao Zedong, when the one really romantic calligraphic flourish was by the one man of China. So Mao Zedong's calligraphy was copied by everybody. I'm sure calligraphers in the audience who are in the exhibition have all attempted his hand at one time or another. Even Hua Guofeng does this calligraphy. And Kang Chen is a very learned man, collector of antiquities and commentators on Chinese old edition books. And there was some calligraphy in the public during Mao's era that was not written by him. And this is Tao Zhu's calligraphy on the Youth Canal. And Deng Xiaoping. Even up into the 90s, when we feel that the old world is pretty much been swept away, that the use of calligraphy as an endorsement of imperial edict and the presence of power was still practiced and understood by everybody. So here's Deng Xiaoping endorsing the special economic zone in Fujian. And here is writing on a highway banner, a highway display. This is Deng Xiaoping that says something about modernizing in Shenzhen. And this is actually erected in the last 15 years. This is a photograph I took about 6-7 years ago. It is a Jiang Zheming's calligraphy endorsing the opening of a building devoted only to bookstores in Shenzhen. And the most telling was in 1997 and also 1999, when Hong Kong was handed over back to China, and when Macau was handed back to China. What Jiang Zheming presented to the city of Hong Kong and to the city of Macau were both, in both instances, a piece of his own calligraphy. Sorry. Now, so the use of calligraphy as a public language of power is still very much in memory. But what about calligraphy as fine art? Here, I want to look at calligraphy as fine art also from a different angle, which is the relation between fine art and mass culture in China. In China, perhaps calligraphy was the most basic, most elementary, and most widely spread training in aesthetics. Well, anybody who has ever, well, especially in the pre-modern days, anybody who could afford to be sent to learn writing would have to learn to construct horizontal lines, vertical lines, slanting lines in a square and make it look nice. And that is probably the most basic kind of aesthetic training every Chinese person went through. And it also is a training for thinking through symbolic imageries. There is this big, long tradition of reading auspices in signs and things, and perhaps the whole writing of words or logographic or ideographic forms has something to do with that. But the important thing to note really is the overlap between fine art and mass art. If calligraphy is considered the queen of all visual arts in China, it is also probably the most widely spread practice form of mass art, even when people did not do it consciously as art. But I do believe people who were taught calligraphy, from my own experience, you were always asked to follow model book. And a model book will always be based on certain great master from the Tang or Song dynasty, or from Wang Xizhi from pre-Tang. And so there is always a dimension, anybody who learned to write, that this is about a form of aesthetic presentation, and you have to do it beautifully. So people always talk about whether one person's calligraphy is ugly, his calligraphy is good looking. So there is a basic aesthetic training, which is embedded in this type of the most rudimentary level of literacy. And the other thing is about about this type of writing and its relation to the egalitarian examination system. Because the type of examination system in the old days were restricted to a very limited set of books. So it was also a very egalitarian system, well, at least in principle, in terms of people who could afford to go through the learning and could afford to go and take examinations, so to compete for official positions. So it was very much a kind of a practical tool that doubles up as fine art, but also doubles up as a language of power. So it is a very interesting angle to think into the meaning of fine art in China and also for contemporary art. And the third issue I want to talk about here is about the paradigm of good calligraphy and its relation to cultural and political power. Apart from personal cultivation and also its use in pragmatic life, what sort of model do you copy when you try to learn calligraphy? And we see in Chu Zijie's case, he copied Wang Xizhi's Lanting the preface to the Lanting poetry gathering. He copied it 1,000 times until it becomes a totally black sheet of paper. But to select the Lanting for Qiu Zhijie is also very strategic, because that is the same piece of calligraphy that's been copied by everybody since the Tang Dynasty who aspired to become a good calligrapher. And this piece of calligraphy was deemed to be the most important piece of writing. And when it was lionized by Tang Taizhong as the sage of calligraphy, everything Wang Shizi did became the most sought after paradigm. So he was probably correct to pick him as the most important calligrapher, aesthetically most astute. But it also means that it was approved by the emperor, and he has got the royal stamp on the selection. So political power and aesthetic power overlapped. And since then, the collection of anthologies of good calligraphy became also one of the very important exercise for the major political figures, especially when they needed to assert their authority in a new way. For example, the only empress in Chinese history, Wu Zhetian, when she took over the Tang Dynasty, she ordered a collection of an anthology printed of all the writings that was considered the best available of Wang Shizi. And the famous Song artist Emperor Huizong, he made one of the most famous anthology, Chunhua Ge anthology of calligraphy, and Emperor Qianlong has his Sanxi Tang Tie. But the important thing is this practice is actually put into modern times. In the 18th, 19th century, one of the major changes in calligraphic styles and calligraphic fashion of the day was the rediscovering of stele script from the pre-Tang Dynasty, and it became a major force in the 19th century. And the major reformer, Kang Youwei, one of his important contributions was Guang Yizhou Shuangji, which is anthology, which is actually a text, a critique of all the available stele scripts that he could gather and make, and it was his critical commentaries of these scripts. So in a way, this type of aesthetic judgment also marked a form of political intervention. Then, of course, we know that he was one of the main intellectuals behind the early reform movement, and later on led to the revolution, which he actually then objected against. But if we come back to the modern time, this is exactly what happened in the 20th century after the Republican era, when Hu Shi's plain writing movement, Baihua Yundong, promoted vernacular writing. And at the same time, there was a big argument during the Republican era whether one should change the writing script. But of course, nobody was powerful enough to do that. And also, there was a lot of different efforts in reorganizing the vocabulary. But it was Mao Zedong when he moved in, and to mark the revolution and the change of an era, he basically just changed the entire Chinese vocabulary into simplified characters. A lot of it based on, of course, the grass script simplification, but and also a lot of very apocryphal inventions which have no etymological link to the past. So this change of language and script is very much part of the whole entire revolution, and is very much a heart of the Chinese modernization program. And I'm going to look at some artist examples to talk about how writing, especially writing, making use of the visual language of power instead of the traditional aesthetics, has worked in the modern time. Now, this is one of the very few proven examples who actually doesn't claim to be an artist. He didn't admit that he was a madman, but he was. He called himself the King of Kowloon, and must be China's earliest graffitist of any note. From the early 60s, he's been doing this kind of defamation of public property. But the interesting thing is the writing he makes on these electricity boxes and on walls in stela is practically all about his land title, his claim to title of land in Hong Kong and Guangzhou. Sometimes the claim is on a flat in a resettlement block, and then he'll give his relations various official and imperial titles. But what it really does bring back is this memory of how stela in the old days used to be the marker of territorial right, and also the public use of writing. And then here's another man who is also comes from the margin of fine art. He was only half mad. He's from the south of Taiwan. When he was 50 years old, as a farmer, he decided to cook he told his wife, I'm going to cook you a meal. And after he cooked her a meal, he went on his knees and said, from tomorrow on, you're going to work and pay for my livelihood. I'm going to become an artist. So from an illiterate, he started to make these very strange writings. I selected two works. This is a couplet. Mind you, he's actually illiterate, so he might recognize like a few dozen characters, but this is basically made-up words. But we can see that there's a lot of sort of word-like imageries inside, and even the butterfly god that he's painted, the body is made up of some sort of pseudo-ideographic figure. This is artist Hong Tong. He is certainly not mad. Gu and Da is in this exhibition. Totem, and this is another thing he did in the 80s, installation calligraphy, positive and negative works. But one thing which Gu and Da does bring across, he must be one of the first people to convince everybody that calligraphy can be completely contemporary and feels monumental. And I think the monumentality was what he achieved. And also his work has a very aggressive, explosive power. But where does that power come from? I think the power that he manages to release comes from the breaking of taboos. Firstly, he's always worked with, firstly, this is something which I would get when I was in school, whether you've written a word wrong or written it correctly. And the entire revolutionary calligraphy, the simplified character, for me growing up in Hong Kong, everybody's writing in wrong words all the time. So here's Gu and Da marking his paper up, correct, incorrect. And also, the breaking of taboo is probably the most powerful way of release power which has been kept under control. And this is one thing I think he worked out. Oh, sorry, the wrong direction. And here is his calligraphy come landscape, giving this sense of writing as though it's something larger than life. It is something bigger than the landscape. And writing is an apparition coming from the skies. And it is with this type of presence that he actually really brings back the power of calligraphy. And this is the installation shot taken in San Francisco, MoCA, which he calls United Nations. he collects hair from different hairdressers around the world, and then he makes these pieces of, make these panels with human hair. And the writing is sometimes real words, sometimes fake, but essentially it is really the power and presence of the words in different languages. Then he started to turn the hair into ink, and he's mixed stela, but what he writes in the stela is mainly also illegible. Wusandran Red Humor. This was made in the mid-80s, and it is a work that was made, it will look familiar to people living in Asia today because you're always covered by all sorts of slogans writing. But from him doing that in the early 80s, it would be a direct contrast to the world of political slogans that one would just emerged from the days of Mao Zedong. The use of the X, this form in China, is very inauspicious. It is, especially the way that it is done like this, is used to seal a box, is used to seal somebody's house if they're confiscated, and it is a sign which is used to seal the lock around the neck of a prisoner, and so he's sealing 1987 here. In contrast to what we're talking about just now, the coming together of the two visual languages of power and Mao has been now revived by artists of the early 90s like Wang Guangyi and Gan Zhengyi's illegible misprinted books. He took a book and reprinted over the same book several times, so nothing is readable. And this set of books is a presence of unreadable script, but it also is a repetition of messages. When messages repeated so much that you cannot actually decipher its true meaning anymore. But on the other hand, the real power today, like what we get from advertising, is not whether the product is any good, but is that you have to hear it enough to see it. And perhaps this is part of the message. Wei Guangqing. This is a traditional Chinese illustrated book, where he has the wall with where the script is, but now it's walled off. So cultural knowledge was walled off. Again, this interest in books. This work was made in 1992 during the first Iraq War. And of course, the famous Xu Bing book from the sky. The magic of this work was that it was so beautifully done. You cannot believe it is not something from a real library. But also, because it's so beautifully done, in a way, it is really a tribute to a past that has been sealed off. Doing the same thing in carving clay print. Xu Bing was trained as a woodblock artist, printmaker. So carving all these blocks, each block in a way is like a mini woodblock print. Here we have the square word calligraphy, the same work Mike explained this morning. What you have on the bottom from the left is SQUARE, square word calligraphy. This is one piece he did. Well, this is just something. There's calligraphy by Chu Zijie. His writing is trying to demonstrate that he did write 1,000 times over the sheet of paper. There wasn't somebody taking count. And printing, this is Chu Zijie again. This is the type of mattress everybody used in the summertime driving in the car in the old days. No air conditioning, very hot. The mattress was what kept your bum cool. And he carved Mao Zedong calligraphy on it, so when you sit on the bare back, you have Mao's writing imprinted on your body. So, again, the relation between the written word and the body. The transformer world and and slogans, printing on the water by Tsong, Zhou Liehai is graffiti work, and lastly, this pseudo-writing, but also like Magic Dow's drawing by Huang Zhiyang from Taiwan. So these are examples of how writing, as the queen of fine arts in the traditional world, has transformed and been taken over today in contemporary art, and how one can actually still see a link between this and the type of calligraphy that we considered aesthetically good and correct, in that they both relate to one very important dimension underlying Chinese society. Thank you very much.